Hello, and welcome to the next installment of our Faithful Conversations. If you joined us last month, you know that this is conversation 2 in a 6-part series, diving into issues that faith leaders have identified as dividing the church today. My name is Andy Sicoscio, and I'm the Director of Congregational Education and Outreach at Sojourners. Tonight, I'll be joined by 2 dear colleagues in faith. The first is professor and author of the book Faithful Politics: 10 Approaches to Christian Citizenship and Why It Matters, Dr. Miranda Cruz, and pastor and author of the book Taming Leviathan: Loving Your Christian Nationalist Neighbor, the Reverend Dr. Campbell. Tonight, we're going to explore the question, what does Christian nationalism have to do with what's happening? I'm not sure we'll cover everything in the time we have, but the chat will be open and we'll take as many questions as we can towards the end of our conversation. So please feel free to post questions and we'll do our best to get to them at the end of the conversation. Also, if you're joining us live, we have 4 copies of their books to randomly give away throughout the session. So keep an eye on the chat. They're going to be randomly selected. So look for that. And lastly, a recording of our time together will be posted on our Sojo Action YouTube page, along with some resources that will probably be mentioned along the way and some questions. So if you'd like to use this talk as a springboard to conversation in your context with your community, feel free to do that. We'll be posting that and sending that link out probably tomorrow. I think that's it by way of announcements. We're really honored that you would take the time to join us. So allow me to introduce my colleagues this evening and we'll get started. First, I'd like to introduce you Dr. Miranda Cruz. She's a member of the Wesleyan Church and has taught theology and church history at Indiana Wesleyan University since 2014. She's my favorite kind of theologian, a practical one. She focuses on the application of Christian doctrine in life and ministry. So welcome, Miranda.
Thanks so much, Andy.
Yeah, I'm so excited you're here. And Caleb Campbell is the lead pastor at Desert Springs Bible Church in Phoenix, Arizona, where he has served since 2006. He's the founder and director of Disarming Leviathan Ministries, which focuses on equipping people to missionally engage Christian nationalists. So welcome, Caleb.
Thanks for having me.
And as we get started, I realize there's probably a lot to talk about, but it seems that maybe the best place for us to start is just with some definitions. I've always approached Christian nationalism with the notion that it's neither Christian nor patriotic. But Miranda, I'm wondering if you might be able to help us by naming what it is that we are talking about. How do you define Christian nationalism? And even what are the various streams that are at work in our context today?
Yeah, I think that's a great place to start. It's one of those terms that has become increasingly fuzzy, and that some people are even saying like, oh, this is just a pejorative that people are making up. And it's not. It is a sociological and theological term, and it really does have meaning. So I like to use the definition that Andrew Whitehead and Samuel Perry used in their book, Taking America Back for God. I find that to be a helpful starting point. So I'm just going to read it. That Christian nationalism is a cultural framework, a collection of myths, traditions, symbols, narratives, and value systems that idealizes and advocates a fusion of Christianity within American civic life. So I find that definition helpful because it encapsulates these different aspects of a culture, a set of values, myths, symbols, and ultimately this fusion of Christianity and America. And if we notice, the thing that's really missing from that definition is anything connected to like creedal belief in Christianity, any kind of profession of faith in Jesus as Lord or anything like that. So as a starting point, we can say Christian nationalism is not Christian by any historical theological definition of what Christianity is. So you mentioned there's a few different streams. So I'll just briefly kind of identify some of those.
Yeah, that would be great. Thanks.
Yeah. So one, I'd say 2 of these really come out of theological traditions, and one of them is really more purely political. So one is from a Christian line of thinking called Christian Reconstructionism. And in Christian Reconstructionism, the basic idea is that the United States needs to be reconstructed according to the law of God, Old Testament law. Some of the most extreme versions of this go so far as literally, stoning people and following the biblical law to that extreme. But even for those who don't go that far, they'd say, well, our model for civil society ought to be the law of God. And so they're going to be working very, very methodically to change policy. And so where you see Christian Reconstructionism tends to be in think tanks, the folks who are working, kind of playing the marathon, playing the long game, trying to work to change public policy over time in a very thoughtful, methodical way. And then you have Dominionism, also known as the Seven Mountains Mandate, or the New Apostolic Reformation is one version of this. And that takes a similar idea that says Christians need to reform society from the top down by gaining control of government. But they add a very strong spiritual warfare dimension. Mm-hmm. So Dominionism, or Seven Mountains Mandate, says that the things that are wrong in America are wrong because of demonic forces that are controlling government and also other areas like business or media, family. And so what Christians need to do is to cast out those demonic spirits that are controlling those areas and then reclaim or dominate those areas as Christians. And so that has a stronger Pentecostal underpinning to it. And then you have the Christian nationalism that's really an ethno-nationalist Christianity. And that's one that I think maybe what most people have in mind when they think about Christian nationalism. And this is the idea that America is a Christian country, but what Christian means in that context is that it is a Western European country. So it's ethno-nationalist in the sense that it defines America according to a shared ethnicity, and that ethnicity is Western European, hence white. It's a white supremacist ideology by nature. And so Christianity, in that version of Christian nationalism, it'll adopt Christian language and symbols and talk a lot about Christian values, but what it's really about is heritage, Western European heritage and ethnicity, and morality, certain moral values, especially around family, sexuality, those kinds of things. And so where the three of these often converge is around those moral issues. And they'll come at those things from different directions, but they kind of converge around this vision of America's moral values and the need to impose and reinforce and maintain those through the means of government.
Well, that's light. I mean, that's a lot. And in many ways, that makes a lot of sense for some of the things that we're seeing. Kayla, I'm curious, you've been tackling the reality of Christian nationalism in the church for a while. What's your perspective on why this is kind of really bubbling to the top more and more in our culture lately?
It seems to me that many people are turning to American Christian nationalism as an answer to the problem that they have, which is anxiety about ethnic erasure. So the fear or the anxiety is, as people are witnessing the diversity in America grow, the effect of pluralism on our society, the neighborhoods are changing, the grocery stores are changing, the job market is changing, and that can cause an anxiety that one is very the palpable pain of your community changing is a very real phenomenon, but that can become a profound anxiety when it gets twisted by purveyors of Christian nationalism who say, "Did you notice the grocery store changed? It's because your way of being is under imminent threat." And that's the extra little step that because you're seeing diversity, you're no longer allowed to be here anymore. You have no home. And so that anxiety of ethnic erasure is causing many people to say, oh, I'm under imminent threat. I need to do something about this. What can I do? Where can I find power? And the movement of American Christian nationalism is saying, we will provide for you safety, belonging, and purpose. And so many are giving themselves over to it. And it works well because it fronts as Christian. And so for many Christians who love their country and love their God, they say, oh, this is not only patriotic, it's also godly. And so that fits two of my deepest convictions. And so it's easy to be drawn into that movement and overlook many of its failings or missteps, things like that.
Yeah, that's such a huge part of it. This sense of anxiety that the world around me is changing, and I think I'd add on to that the kind of paired concern about a real or perceived shift in morals.
Yeah.
The way people see the country as well, for decades, seemingly everyone was in agreement about what marriage is, or about what sexual ethics is, or even what men's and women's roles were, those kinds of things. And so as those are shifting, and especially in the last 10 years or so have shifted very rapidly, there's this unsettledness. And so the response to that is to reassert this control and say, okay, we need to take back our country. And if the majority are not going to align with these historic Christian mores, then majority rule is a problem. And we're seeing that right now. Some of the shift away from democratic ideals has a lot to do with that, saying, okay, well, democracy fails if the majority aren't upholding Christian values. And so what really matters is that we're able to get into the halls of power so that we can bring back this sense of moral foundation. And it doesn't really matter whether that's what the country wants or not, because that's what our Christian nationalist ideology calls for.
Now, I'm kind of curious because as you say this, like in my mind, ethno-nationalists are probably more likely to be white. And I can see that playing out in some of the white supremacy ideology that is out there. But it seems like there would be almost a natural conflict, like in the world of Dominionists, that tends to be a little bit more multi-ethnic. So don't we have sort of a conflict within Christian nationalism? Like how in these two different ideologies is there enough, is inertia moving both streams forward when they seem maybe a little bit at odds?
Yeah, they definitely are at odds. And it's confusing when you see Dominionist speakers, folks like Che Ahn is one leader of that movement who is an immigrant, and he's Korean. And how can he be kind of on the same page as people who are really virulent xenophobes, some of them? And it is these two different streams of Christian nationalism that especially Hispanic, African American, Asian, has this Pentecostal foundation, or charismatic networks of churches that are global networks. Matthew Taylor has done a lot of work in this area, tracing out these global networks and showing how they're connected to each other. And so they're really fighting this spiritual battle, much of which has to do with the morality and less with the ethno part. So it's about, who is controlling the country? Well, it should be God. It should be Christians. They're not so much engaged with the white nationalism piece of that, but where they have common cause around those cultural values and gaining dominion over the government, then they're going to be willing to kind of set some of those differences aside for the sake of the greater cause.
Yeah, and you're right to notice the theological and ideological diversity within the movement. So you've got like J.D. Vance, who's Catholic, You've got Pete Hegseth, who attends a Doug Wilson church, which would be Reformed Reconstructionist, to my understanding. You got Paula White, who's definitely from a charismatic background. Historically, so I've like in my lifetime, those three tribes wrote books against each other and like rarely got along. And I've been to dozens of gatherings that are held by purveyors of Christian nationalism, some of them massive gatherings, some of them smaller. And one of the resounding themes is unity and the unity of the church. And what you'll hear is a statement like this: our theological differences really matter, whether you ordain a woman to preach or not, or you baptize babies or you baptize grown-ups. These are really important debates, theological debates. But if we don't unite ourselves together and take the power back, we will be having these debates behind bars. So the existential threat of erasure is binding some folks who, generally speaking, don't get along together for exactly what you said, common cause. The question now is, can they hold it together?
Yeah. And we don't
so
know.
many questions in my head right now. I'm curious about, in the world of the church, what, this Christian nationalism, again, it's not Christian per se. Why do you think, or where as Christian leaders, what did we miss? Like, how did we get here in that regard? Is it a discipleship thing? Is it, like what do you have any thoughts on how is it that so many folks who are Christian are essentially led into these spaces in a world where we're working hard to try to disciple and teach people and give them an authentic faith, when so much of this seems to be anti-faith?
Miranda, what do you think?
I mean, when I was watching,
it's a $1 million question, right?
when I was watching the footage of the riots at the Capitol, the January 6th riots, my first thought was that this is a failure of discipleship. But I think that failure goes back probably decades. And the church, being evangelical church in particular, but not exclusively, being ill-equipped to address society, to address public life in a meaningful way. And so predominantly, throughout the 70s, the kind of address to the public, as much as that had anything to do with politics, was largely anti-communism. And then when you get into the 80s and 90s, then it has a lot more to do with gender, and abortion gets activated as a political issue. But it's always very confined. There's not a coherent political theology or a framework for just helping kind of run-of-the-mill evangelicals understand the world and their place in it. And so it becomes very combative, that the world is a scary place that's out to get you, that you're going to be poisoned or tainted by too much involvement with the world. This was certainly my experience in evangelical culture in the 90s. And so I think that is part of it, the sense that we're the aggrieved minority, even though Christians are still the significant majority. And the world is our enemy. The world is something we need protection from. And then as the world changes more and more, it kind of adds fuel to that concern, because now, you can point to specific laws or specific actions or perceived shifts in the culture as they see, like they're out to get us. We're no longer the majority, we're no longer the dominant culture. And as Caleb says, this threat of erasure, we are under attack. And so we need to either, batten down the hatches, or we need to fight back. And we're seeing both right now, but we're seeing the fight back, I think, more strongly.
Yeah, I think I would push it back a little further. I think Christian nationalism started in the Garden of Gethsemane when the mob came to take Jesus, Peter, a leader in the church, to be anachronistic, wanted to do something really good. He wanted to protect Jesus, the one he loves. And Peter, when the mob comes to take Jesus, as Jesus is reaching for the cross, Peter reaches for his sword. Why? Well, because Peter cannot imagine how cruciform power could transform society. He cannot imagine a power force greater than the sword. And so he reaches for the sword. And in that famous scene, Jesus says, "Put your sword away. He who lives by the sword dies by the sword." And for 2,000 years, the church, wanting to do good things, wanting to advocate or propagate the way of Jesus, has numerous times and in manifold ways fallen into the temptation of Peter in Gethsemane. We want to do a good thing. We want righteous ends. But what's a little kingdoms of this world power to get us there? Like, doesn't the ends justify the means? And we put Machiavelli over Messiah. And I would notice all of us have this problem. Now, I don't reach for the sword of American Christian nationalism, but I reach for the sword of mammon. I mean, when everything starts feeling shaky, I check my stock portfolio because in my heart, I wrestle with resting in the peace of a bank account. I think my future is more solid when I look at the amount of zeros in my bank account. And so I know what it's like to give into the temptation of reaching for kingdoms of this world power. American Christianity, the American Evangelical Church is giving itself over to American Christian nationalism. For 1,600 years before that, it was Christendom. I mean, since the days of Constantine, we have had opportunity to reach for the sword. And the reason why it's happening is because we cannot imagine how cruciform power could actually lead to life and life abundant.
Yeah, I'd absolutely agree with that. We have a fundamental lack of trust. And I think that's, as Caleb said, that's a problem that all Christians wrestle with in different ways. Am I really, trusting God? And I think one of the things I see, especially with the Reconstructionist version of Christian nationalism, it comes out of the Reformed tradition. And in Reformed theology, like the key word is sovereignty, like the sovereignty of God. If you're curious what the Reformed persons say about that, it's the sovereignty of God. But in this kind of anxious need to gain control, it really belies a fundamental disbelief in the sovereignty of God. And say, okay, God is sovereign as long as we can put him on the throne. And this anxiety where you see interpreting cultural shifts or declines in Christianity or church attendance or things like that as somehow God having been knocked off the throne. And so we have to do everything we can to, prop God back up. That's also a discipleship problem. That's a faith and a trust problem. And Christian nationalism is one version of that trust problem.
Yeah, when Christianity is reduced to a set of curated ethical norms, and cultural elements, it loses its power. I mean, to be a Christian is to give full allegiance to Christ. And so the idea of Christian nationalism, right, putting Christians in charge of an entity that demands allegiance is a contradiction in terms. It's either all allegiances to Christ or not, and governments demand allegiance. And so Christians are frequently finding themselves in conflict of where does my hope lie? Where does my trust lie? Where does my allegiance lie? And it's very tempting to give our hearts over to the emperor, especially when the emperor draws crosses on their stuff.
Yeah. Yeah. And that reduction of Christianity to just a set of moral and cultural values, I think that Christian nationalism, again, is one way and one threat that happens. But I think progressive Christians are just as inclined to reduce Christianity to just a set of ethical norms and kind of evaluate Christians based on how well are they holding up these ethics. They're kind of different ethical priorities. Now, it manifests super differently. It doesn't end up being violent extremism the way that Christian nationalism does. But I think that can give us some, get the plank out of our own eye, kind of like, okay, where am I doing some of the same things, just with very different results? And then, as so much of Caleb's work is focused on connecting with people who are in this mindset, we can't connect with people who are deeply entrenched in different versions of Christian nationalism if we don't genuinely have a compassion and even an experiential understanding of where they're coming from and how they got there and why those ideas are appealing, so that we can then peel back, what does it actually mean to follow Jesus and not just adhere to a particular cultural norm or moral code.
Yeah.
And it's what you're saying, and what, if I'm hearing all of this, I hear this thread of fear, and being, who we are, like, oh, perfect love casts out fear. And yet fear is the bottom of so much of this. It's fear of losing control, which we've never had, but we think we do. It's fear of being othered, which, how many, when I think of the multitudes around the throne and, Revelation, the cultures that are there, like, we are all othered because there's so many people, and there's so, the ethnos that are around, that worship God. And so it's interesting that, to me, as I think about what role does fear play in dividing us, and then what role do we as faith leaders, what do we have in repairing a fearful faith with a faithful faith? And so I really appreciate, Miranda, your insistence that, like, hey, be empathetic. Like, remember, people don't wake up in the morning and think, I'm going to be an idiot today. Like, we really want to be faithful. We really want to be, Caleb, like you said, Peter isn't reaching for his sword out of lazy faith. He's trying to exercise his faith. And so I guess with that, there's to maybe pivot into a practical space of how do we as faith leaders engage folks in our congregations, and maybe even like, what do some of these streams look like in the average congregation, if there is even a way to say that, how might they show up, and how might we speak to maybe the fears that are behind us, just as faith leaders, to be compassionate and to be wise.
Exactly. I'll let you start with that one, Caleb. That's really part of your work.
The problem is not primarily in the head, it's in the heart. This is a matter of deep and profound anxiety. And this is, by the way, why, if you've ever had the phenomenon where you've got a loved one who is saying incorrect things, you present them with facts, footnoted and all, and they don't change. One of the reasons why is the head won't change unless the heart feels safe. And if the heart does not feel safe, Jonathan Haidt says, the head's not going to change. And so this is not a logic problem. It's not a data problem primarily. Those things do matter, but they're a secondary point of conversation. First, we need to connect heart to heart. So if I approach somebody who's saying something like, lizard people run the government, I'm going to hear that and I'm going to feel all sorts of feelings because that person's, in my family, in my church, whatever. So step number one, process what's going on inside of me with the Lord. Because if I meet anxiety with anxiety, if I meet rage with rage, I'm only contributing to the evil in the world. If I'm in a place of health, then I have a choice to make. Do I say, where are your facts? Where did you hear that from? Right? Kind of an accusatory, I can't believe you believe that thing. Or I can invite them into a heart level conversation by saying something like, I'm not seeing that, but would you tell me a story about why that matters to you? And eventually we can get to shared values. For instance, I think the government should be run by people who are trustworthy. I think that too, right? And as soon as we get to shared values, we can actually continue the conversation at a deeper level back up to the headspace. So the first thing I would say is my objective in this relationship, in this conversation, to be right? Or is it to invite them into a conversation that might lead both of us towards reconciliation and both of us more into Christ-likeness? If it's the second, then how I am being in the conversation is of utmost importance. Am I compassionate? Am I hospitable? Am I welcoming? Am I inviting? And that takes, by the way, as I'm saying that, I can feel so many of you listening to this, rolling your eyes, cringing, and gritting your teeth at me because this is hard work. And I would notice, I would agree with you. I don't want to do any of that stuff. I would notice that Jesus was always doing this kind of work. See, when we think about Christian nationalism, so many of us want to flip tables. And I think there's time for flipping tables. But how many times did Jesus flip tables? And then how many times was he setting tables? He was constantly inviting people to the table, people who didn't belong together, people who had radically different ideas about the nature of truth or politics or whatever it was. I think that's instructive to us that the way out of this mess is hospitality and heart level communication. But I also noticed not only was Jesus constantly setting tables for hospitality, he was frequently exasperated with those that were following him, and he was always ghosting people. People would turn around and be like, "Where'd Jesus go?" And he's like, he ran up into the mountain to pray, like, and take a nap. Like, he's taking naps. Why? Because he's exhausted. Because this work is taxing. It's missionary work, and I mean missionary in the positive sense of the term. It's work to carry the burden of the relationship that has distance between you and me. So that would be that's like the nugget of all of this is think that, remember, this is not in the head, it's in the heart.
Yeah, I think when we're having those conversations, if we're in that heart space where I can be in such a relationship with this person that however well I know them, I know that searching my own heart, like I'm coming from a place of love and a desire for unity. That translates, that communicates. People can tell if you are talking to them because you want to start an argument, and most people aren't interested in that. And the people who are, it's not going to lead anywhere because they just want to argue. So I think the power of asking a good question, I think Caleb's question is great, and having those maintained relationships where you can just say, like, tell me more about that. Like that, for one thing, it communicates if you are genuinely wanting to understand, which I think we have to, that communicates, and people will answer that question. Like maybe coming from a place of wanting to evangelize you into agreeing with them. But the more they have the opportunity to talk and are being asked to actually articulate what they think and why, the more opportunity they have to kind of rethink what they're thinking. Sure. Like, why do I think that? And part of that as well, I think it can relieve the pressure on us to actually know and understand everything. So I see from my college students a lot, they feel so overwhelmed by just not understanding things. There's so much happening in the world. And so there's this sense of like, well, I can't really engage in this conversation because I don't feel like I know enough. I haven't read all the books on Christian nationalism, and I don't know how to define my terms, and I don't know what all of this is. If you're grounded in faith in Jesus Christ, and you can ask some good questions, you don't need to have all the right information or all the data. As Caleb said, the data doesn't help you anyway. It may come to that point in a conversation and then you can look it up. But you can ask meaningful questions that give people the opportunity to think. And then you're able to notice, like, wait, you said this a minute ago, but now you're saying this. Can you help me understand the connection between those? Or I see how you love your family and how deeply involved you are at church. And, tell me about your relationship with Christ and how is that translating to the way you understand the world. Deeper conversations like that, that can lead somewhere if you're willing to, and have the mental and emotional energy, to put in that relationship work over the long haul.
I mean, what you're saying is so powerful. And I think it sort of goes against the grain of what, like I grew up in kind of an evangelical tradition that was always like, hey, the way that we approach people is that we listen for opportunities to talk to them about something that's important to us so we can change their mind and they'll think more like we do. we call that evangelism. And in that sense, the irony is that, yeah, what I've said to someone 20 years ago is really different than what I would have said 10 years ago, which is different than what I would even say, to get them to convert to my belief today. And I think what you're saying in this space is, holding curiosity that's outside of, I have to be right and you are wrong. For one, like there's a place in saying, like, let's be curious. Let's look at this. What does the scripture say? What does Jesus say? And Caleb, I love what you're saying about shared values. That's mediation 101. What's the shared value? Because I do think that there's a sense in which we are transformed by the renewing of our minds. And part of that is we have to let go of things every day, not just once. We do it every day. And I'm thinking about one of the questions in the chat is, gosh, how do you get a healthy small group ministry? What role does that play in something like this? And I think it's, as I think about that, it's creating a space where people can be curious, where you don't have to be right or wrong, or numbers aren't trying to convert people to them, but actually to Jesus. And that we are also willing to be converted in the process of that conversation. And there's a lot of letting go of power in that, which feels really important to this conversation, because it seems like a lot of the Christian nationalism stuff is actually there's a power kind of grab going on, and yeah. So as I think about all these things, I'm like, wow, it's interesting to hear this. It's true. As faith leaders, this is what we need to do, to set a table where people can come hungry. All of us, even the host, in a sense, comes hungry and asks those questions. Yeah, thank you. Are there any other, any other suggestions? Like, Caleb, I wonder if you can give an example of something that you tried that maybe didn't work, and what you changed about it next time to make it that kind of a space be more a more helpful conversation space for you.
Sure. Yeah, so American Christian nationalism ripped through my community, my relationships. My 80% of our church left by the end of 2020. I have hundreds of broken relationships around this stuff, and I was approaching it primarily as a heresy to fight, thinking if I could just out Bible these people, right? I'm an evangelical. I work at a Bible church, so I'm like, Bible's my thing, and if I could out Bible them, they will see the way of truth more clearly, and we'll be reconciled, and we'll go back to the way it never was. I had an engagement with somebody, and it was a representative of a local purveyor of American Christian nationalism, an employee, and they were trying to sell me a curriculum that they wanted me to do at our church. This is a few years back. And I'm like, oh, I'm going to take this meeting because I'm going to just like argue and, totally destroy their Bible stuff. So the meeting is set. I'm expecting this like curmudgeon-y, mean-spirited, like person. No, in walks this effervescent young person who's like, hello, Pastor Caleb, how are you? Like, between the two of us, they were the more joyful of the bunch. And she is sharing with me how important Jesus is to her and the Bible is to her. And then she's making statements that I think are way out there. Like, well, like what the Bible says about our God-given right to bear arms. And, what the Bible says about school choice. And I'm like, what does the Bible say about, So in this meeting, it's becoming clear to me, like, oh, she really believes all this stuff. And then she says, Pastor, like after 2 hours of talking, she says, Pastor Caleb, politics is really important, but at the end of the day, I just want to follow Jesus. And I said, oh, tell me how you met Jesus. And she said, oh, last year at a Christian nationalist rally. So her entire discipleship had been inside of this system. And it was in that moment that I sensed the Spirit of God say, Campbell, you're an idiot. They don't need an enemy to fight them. They need a missionary to reach them. And it was really that moment. And my whole posture shifted in the moment. Because if I was reaching out to someone of a completely different culture, I would be way more curious. I would not assume. I would not feel familial shame. And moreover, I would really want to learn from them. And what I for me, the big aha moment was applying that to people that I thought I knew, people that of a communion that I'm already a part of. And so that shift helped me to connect heart to heart, whereas before I was just going head to head on quoting the Bible.
Yeah, makes sense. Miranda, I wonder if in all of this, you are largely in academic spaces, but I wonder, what have you learned as you've been on this journey? Probably more intensely than you ever intended to of late. But are there, any wisdom that you'd like to share?
Yeah, I think for me, it's been increasingly important to be just nonpartisan. My students who've had me for a long time could probably guess my position on some issues. But for the most part, they're like, I don't know what Cruz thinks. And they're very clear about the Christian nationalism not being a good option. Like it's almost a running joke. So they get that. But I think it's the reason that's become so important that, I have strong political convictions and leanings and all of that. But to give people what in their mind is a viable alternative to Christian nationalism for those who want to be politically engaged. I think the majority of people who are in a Christian nationalist stream, whichever stream it may be, I got there because they recognized something of a faith that they already had. Said, oh, like kind of like how we might see a Jesus fish or whatever on a business. We're like, oh, they're Christian too. They see this familiar language, they see the familiar symbols, and they're drawn to that. And I think that's good. That's a natural thing to have that kind of familial recognition. But then things get set up, framed in such a way that if you are a Christian and you mean it, then this is the only way to express that politically, is to abolish any kind of nuance, or any way that you might think, well, my Christian faith holds this conviction, but when it comes to politics, it's more complicated. Like we don't like that kind of nuance. And so we go to either this Christian nationalist fusion of our faith and our politics, or we just keep them completely separate and say, well, I can't bring my faith into my politics at all because of separation of church and state or something, that's not really what that means. But and so if we can show people there's actually multiple really good ways to be engaged with politics as a Christian that don't require you to leave your faith at the door, that can lead people to have, good faith, different positions on policy. So I see, if you recognize, okay, going as far as Christian nationalism, that's a problem. Xenophobia is anti-Christian, like these things can't fit together. You say, okay, well, what are my options? What am I supposed to do? Like, well, you can be like a normal conservative Christian who's engaged in politics. Like that's a thing. You can be a conservative Christian who is also a political conservative who is not a Christian nationalist. You can be a Christian conservative who's a little more progressive politically. You can be a progressive Christian who leans conservative in your politics. Like all of those combinations are legitimate good faith options for Christians. And none of them require you to abandon your faith or to, completely isolate yourself from politics. They just require you to be willing to do much harder, more nuanced work of thinking through what's the relationship between my faith and my politics. Christian nationalism, all of its streams kind of outsource all of that. Like you don't really have to think in any kind of nuanced way. You just have to say, here's my faith conviction. Now, how do I make it policy? Or how do I cast out the demons that are preventing that from becoming policy? And so there's no critical thinking involved.
I love that. And I think actually I'm going to put it in the chat. One of the things that Sojourners is building more and more is this position, we call it a call to civic discipleship. And the idea that exactly what you're saying. As Christians, we live in community. We live in the polis, in the city, in the larger body of humanity, and how we live impacts. There's a give and take, and so to bring our authentic Christian self to that space is part of what it means to be an embodied follower of Jesus. And so I love that, and I think. I love too that people want certitude. They want to know what's the right way, and you say, figure it out. So,
or don't.
Or don't, yeah. But
become okay with not having it all figured out and just try to be as faithful as you can in that tension.
That's awesome. Yeah, agreed. We've got a few minutes for Q&A, and I want to make sure that we switch to that at this point. One of the questions that's come up goes back a little bit earlier to our conversation, so I'm going to pose that to you all, asking us to contrast the definition of Christian nationalism with that of Kaler and Underwood in their book, Baptizing America, How Mainline Protestants Helped Build Christian Nationalism. They see this movement as going back many decades, at least as far as World War II, led by mainstream public opinion leaders who advocated for our Judeo-Christian heritage. Any comments on that?
Sure. I absolutely, like, if I'm a historian by training, so I can take this back as far as as you want to take it. But certainly post World War II, you have this Christian consensus that builds, and some of that is related to civil religion. And so post World War II, you have the Cold War, right? And you have the Soviet Union, atheistic, communist. Fuse those three together. Those are the enemy. Soviet communism, atheistic enemy. In response to that, you have this corresponding fusion of America, Christian, capitalist. And Judeo-Christian gets added at this time. That wasn't a common phrase before the 1950s, but it starts including Judeo-Christian basically as a response to the anti-Semitism of the World War II period. So like, okay, we better include Judeo in this so it doesn't seem exclusionary. So say, okay, if our great enemy is Soviet communist atheist, then we, the good guys, are America, Christian, capitalist. And so this fusion carries through all different aspects of culture. You have In God We Trust being added to our currency. You have one nation under God being added to the Pledge of Allegiance during this time period. And so that kind of intentional infusion of Christianity into American culture is in direct response to atheist communism in our great enemy in the Soviet Union. And that movement morphs, it becomes complicated. It responds to the women's movement, the sexual revolution, all of those things, to evangelicals being reactivated as a voting bloc in the late 70s. But certainly there were some very intentional things that happened in the 1950s that really deeply embedded the groundwork for Christian nationalism. I wouldn't quite call all of that Christian nationalism, just in the way we use the term today. It's more of a civil religion, but it's certainly the groundwork for what we see today as Christian nationalism. It has Christian nationalistic elements, but we associate that today more with politically active, risks of extremism, that kind of thing. I think what was going on in the 50s is a little different, but it certainly is foundational for what we see today. You're muted, Andy.
Andy, I think you're muted.
Sorry. Thank you. Question in the chat. Could you speak to the in between, the tie between rather what is often called the prosperity gospel and Christian nationalism?
I mean, I'm glad to.
Yep.
prosperity gospel at its root is that to follow the way of Jesus and to do so well will get you rewards now. And the rewards are financial health, financial wealth and physical health. So it's you know, sex, money, and power are the great gods of humanity, and we worship them in different ways. And it basically leverages those things. It says, oh, the way of Jesus also has sex, money, and power, and you get a lot of it, and here you go. It fits neatly with Christian nationalism because Christian nationalism says, how do you protect all of that? Your power, your money, your way of being. It will be in charge. And so if let me say it like this, if your treasure is on earth, where moth and rust destroy, to leverage some of Jesus' teaching, then you need earthly power to protect those heavenly rewards. And so it's kind of like, if God's going to give me all these earthly goodies, then I need an earthly king to protect my goodies. And so in that way, they're great partners, and they work well together.
Yeah, and I think at the more like social societal level, you have the version of prosperity gospel that's rooted in a covenant theology that says, as long as the country is honoring God, then God's going to bless the country. That gets individualized. But I think it's especially in the kind of reformed Reconstructionist iterations of the prosperity gospel, we see that as like, okay, the reason that so many bad things are happening in the country is because we've abandoned faith in God. And so if we can get the country back to God politically, because we're not going to convince every individual to follow Jesus, so we're just going to do it politically, then God is going to bless America. I remember seeing this a meme, I guess, after one of the many school shootings. I don't remember which one. And it was basically saying, well, school shootings happen because we took God out of schools. It's that same kind of thinking, like, oh, if we just put God back in school shootings won't happen. And that was before the Christian school shooting in, I believe it was Tennessee or Kentucky. That was shortly after that. But my formative experience of my adolescence was the Columbine shooting, and that was my sophomore year of high school, and it was a few miles away from my house. And I'm like, God was there. That didn't happen because we took God out of school. There was basically a revival movement in Colorado high schools after that, and school shootings have continued to happen. But I think that kind of prosperity teaching on a mass scale is deeply rooted in this. And then in the Pentecostal iteration with Dominionism, the overlaps, as Caleb mentions, like between the prosperity gospel as it shows up sometimes in some Pentecostal movements or preachers, overlaps. A lot of those same people are the ones who are preaching Christian nationalism, like Paula White, for example.
Yeah, well, it's a lot. This is a lot. It's good. As our time is coming to a close, I wonder if there's one of the questions that's come up. A couple of people actually have asked this: are what study guides, maybe, or resources might you recommend for people who want to learn more about this, or even lead a small group to kind of dive into Christian nationalism and its impact in the community? So any suggestions that you might have, we can put links in the chat, and we'll also send that out afterwards in a follow-up email. And I would be happy to plug your book as well. Caleb, feel free.
Yes, I am a capitalist. So the first one, especially if you're in a mega church, is get every small group in that mega church to buy Disarming Leviathan, Loving Your Christian Nationalist Neighbor. Thank you. There's a lot of great resources. I think it depends on which angle you're coming from. I tend to focus on the like practical and tactical, like how do you talk to people? And a great book that's not directly about Christian nationalism, but is about how to have difficult conversations is a book called Saving Us by Catherine Hayhoe. and her lane is in climate change. And she's writing as a Christian. She's a climate scientist, and she is so compassionate and kind and thoughtful in her writing. And she's also extremely brilliant too. So her book is really, really helpful in navigating how do you have a conversation about a topic where you both fundamentally disagree about the very nature of the concept that you're talking about. And her work's extremely helpful, in my opinion.
Yeah, I'm not above plugging my book. And there's a free study guide for churches, or there's two. There's one that's more for churches, and there's one that's more for academic, like classroom settings. Those are free on the IVP website. In addition, I think the website, podcast, book called The After Party has some good resources. They're very nonpartisan, like how do we think through these things? Well, less about Christian nationalism, more about where do we actually go from here constructively. I'm not sure how well it would work as a group study, but the book Psychology of Christian Nationalism has good, especially the last chapter in particular, has tips for talking to people. It uses actually methods for that people use when they're trying to lead people out of cults. So that's kind of the psychology it's coming from, but it's the kinds of things that Caleb has talked about, asking good questions and not being combative, and, helping them kind of lead themselves out of this way of thinking. Honestly, I think studying scripture together is the best place to start. I think I got to thinking about these things through studying Christian history, but then through studying the minor prophets, and does God seem to be concerned about? And if you're studying scripture faithfully in community, and not being sidetracked by other agendas or topics or things like that, but just actually working through what does scripture actually say, I think that can be a really powerful antidote, and is always a good use of time for a group of Christians.
And kind of make alone. Thank you for that. And I think, so much of what we've talked about tonight just tells me that, there are really good people in our world. There's a lot of who are fraught with, I think, like all of us. Caleb, when you said earlier, like, wow, I'm tired. Like, yeah, I think we're all kind of tired right now. It's hard. And as we come into Easter week, which is always there's a sense of the impressive, the weight of what we do as well. And I think the idea of fear not and love, and those two things really seem to go together. And so I appreciate so much these just your thoughtfulness. I think the compassion with which you engage this question and the people that it represents. These aren't just issues, these are human beings. They are people who carry the inherent dignity of God in them, who we may disagree with, who we may side with one way or the other, but we're called to love regardless. So thank you for this incredible reminder tonight of our work as followers of Jesus. We need to wrap up, but before we do that, I just want to thank you again, Caleb and Miranda, for sharing your wisdom. Thank you for the incredible impact and time that you've put into writing books and equipping the church to know how to navigate hard conversations and important conversations. I love, Miranda, as we study history so that we can move forward. And there's something really wise about that. And I'm thankful for your work in that space. For Caleb, as a pastor, we're all stepping in it right now. So we hear you too, and I'm grateful for that. For all of you who joined us tonight again, this is part of a series of conversations. Please be on the lookout for next month's webinar, which will look at how do we preach truth and teach truth in an age of disinformation. So you'll see more information on that. So thank you all for coming. Thank you, Miranda and Caleb, and we'll be in touch soon.
Thanks, Amy.
Thanks so much.